Thank you very much, Jack. I think that's Jack. Hi, everyone. Thank you for spending some sunny section of today in this darkened room. This is a point that I, in my occupational hazard as a political philosopher, tend to introduce. So rather than propositional thinking, that is, I put forward something, we debate it, and then we come to some synthesis, perhaps some new knowledge, or at least some deeper knowledge about ourselves and how we think. I'd like us to try something that a friend, Faneuil Antwi, who is the Canada Research Chair in Black Arts and Epistemologies at the University of British Columbia, likes to phrase as prepositional thinking. So as we warm up, as we huddle in, as we cool with, how are we alongside each other, not for or against, but alongside, because that is a human condition. And if we are to make any action at all, collectively, we had better get used to that. There are some wonderful collaborations in this particular festival this year, especially in the visual arts. I'll speak to that a tiny bit. I'll also bring some of the instances that may be familiar to you from around the world or completely new. Before we start, in the spirit of prepositional thinking, I wonder whether we might turn backwards and forwards, because you're probably sitting next to somebody you already know, and just introduce yourself, and maybe a word about why you're interested in coming to this particular session. So those of us who are being a tiny bit shy or asocial and sitting alone, I suppose you might have to move a tiny bit. And now that we are rounding up the warming up of our vocal cords, we might begin. I'll be speaking for around 40 to 45 minutes. I shall time myself so that there is a bit of time for us to have a discussion or for there to be questions and answer. I'm very grateful for being mic'd up. Thank you to our technical team at the back. So, as I promised, we are warming up, and I think we've started a tiny bit. This particular presentation comes in 3 parts that come in triplets, if you will. If it's too neat, I am sorry, but I promise that there will be something that is more than the sum of those differences. So, we are here at the Galway International Arts Festival. I'm Cissie Fu. I come to you most recently from Singapore. I am head of the School of Fine Arts at LaSalle College of the Arts, University of the Arts, Singapore. And prior to that, I was in Canada, in the Netherlands, in the UK for a spell, and also was in North America for some part of my education, but I was born in Hong Kong. That would give you perhaps a sense of an arc, somehow back to the West, if you will, traveling from Galway, which is already in the West. So this is to say that we're always relative in position to each other. And insofar as we take any particular stance, there are different ways to render it. There is, I hope, no absolute, if only so that we could continue to be in generative conflict so we can have conversations and spaces to think together. So under one big tent, let's risk a different militancy with a touch of martial art, if you will. In the previous talk, there was some concern around the ways, perhaps, when we speak about climate action, on the one hand, it is activist. The messages might be impactful because they're concise and precise, but perhaps those messages doesn't really quite allow for a debate. You either agree or disagree, you are for me or against me, you are with me or against me. That seems to be the rhetoric that sometimes gets us into trouble, globally, geopolitically, and sometimes with people whom we love. So how do we move from that kind of activism, perhaps, to a more artful one? Going backwards, if any of us are curious about the AE linked together as a grapheme, it's not a diphthong, it is a play of a particular concept. To have things be effective means that we can see material change, that there is immediate impact or long-term impact that could be measured. To be affective is perhaps to shift the capacity that we have for any effect to hit us. So for climate action to be affective, if you will, is to connect the effect with the affect. Really not so much, perhaps, only relying on the reasoning of facts and evidence and data as so well presented at the last lecture, but also to combine it with the ways in which there are emotional data, if you will, or emotional facts that we must take into account. Think about the last time you made a big change in your life. I'm sure there are good reasons for it, external and internal. But when we decide to move countries for a loved one, when we just decide to make a big purchase because we so love that particular thing that would bring us joy at home, how are we moved towards that decision? Some of us have pros and cons lists, others of us just know, and we learn that we already know. So perhaps that is a shorthand of talking about affect, that immediate emotional response such that it motivates us, gives us will to act. A show of hands, please, those of us who were at Sabotage last night at the Big Tent. Thank you. So those of us who were there would have seen something quite spectacular. How it's spectacular is also the ways in which all the members of the troupe are so close to the audience and around. In fact, the ways in which that particular radical circus, if you will, is encircled by an audience that it dares to meet the gaze and the challenge of all the lived experiences that were presented on stage. Yes, there are acrobatics. Yes, it is artful, but at the same time, it's also about not shying away from that particular challenge of beating otherness. So, in No Fit State's Sabotage, what we saw is a kind of testing of the tightrope. We know the rope is taut enough to hold particular tensions, that there is tensility in the materiality of the rope. There's also the bareness or the very firm plastic and rubber that protects the soul of the particular acrobat. But at the same time, there is also the testing through different body parts that have been used in order to continue to make a difference in the way that we come together, not just with human beings, but with all the materialities around us. If we believe that what we do in the arts, or as we walk on the ground every day, is a kind of technogenesis. I walk on the stage, it gives a tiny bit. I've got heels on my boots, and that allows me to walk in a particular way. None of that are taken for granted. It is designed. It might not be an intentional choice on my part. I might not know the particular flooring. But those of us who perhaps move on stage a lot, who dance, and perhaps even run, and do all sorts of different sports, would have experienced that particular interaction. So if we're thinking about the kind of joyful militancy that we have experienced, or what sabotage actually proposes, we talked about joy at the opening of the festival yesterday at the reception, but also it came back as a theme at the lecture earlier today. What is this joyful militancy such that we continue to fight, but take a joyful position? So as we engage in activism and look at effect, what is the affect that keeps us there to continue to resist? This is a little passage from Nick Montgomery and Carla Bergman's Joyful Militancy. You will find the entire text for free. It's published by AK Press, but it's in the anarchistlibrary.org. So the point here is that whenever we propose something different, how do we make sure that it doesn't get taken as a handbook or guideline, a rule to be followed? When we ask, what should we do now, how does the normativity of the should actually stop us from being creative, to exercise imagination? Perhaps not so much appeal to authority, or somebody with more experience, or with more age, or more power, but to also look around us to see what resources we have. Who is the audience around the circus? That is me or us. If I am chaotic and I'm messy, is there a good reason? Is there an appreciation for that reason such that we could move together rather than clean up the mess, as it were? Yeah. Every time we solve a problem, we create new problems. Perhaps a lesser problem for me or for us. Maybe a problem worth having. So if we don't shy away from problems anyway when we solve them, there is not too much issue in the ways in which we continue to live in complexity. So what Nick and Carla here reminds us is that what we are after is not a new critique or a new position, but a process. The process of movement itself and the growth of creativity, struggle, experimentation, and collective power. There were questions at the end of the last lecture as to, well, how do we come together? There are small individual personal things that we can do, but sometimes they feel insignificant, so we are lodged and stay in despair. What is this collective power that we're able to wield, and how can we come together? Those of us who will see sabotage, if we haven't seen it already, will find that through the ways that the troupe actually coordinates and choreographs and also makes eye contact to bring in the audience, that motivates action. In many ways, the arts is effective because we are completely immersed and brought into a different realm, such that we are beside ourselves for a moment, perhaps in fear, excitement, or just in appreciation and awe. These are emotions that motivate us to perhaps seek more of the wonder that we see in these beautiful, vast images of polar ice caps melting. What are the images that we want to participate in order to create something that would also inspire awe? This is a social sculpture from a recent exhibition, in fact, still going on in Singapore at one of the two remaining dragon kilns in Southeast Asia. This one has been dormant for 20 years, so decommissioned, and at some point the government of Singapore wished to demolish it such that the entire territory could be reused. Somebody from the Singapore Tourism Board decided, no, let's keep it. It's a piece of heritage. And surrounding that dragon kiln are now around 20 clay studios. Angie Sia is an artist, started as an illustrator, painter, moved into sound, performance, and now in social practice. She will be joining you in Ireland next year as an Atlantic Fellow in Equity and Brain Health. She works with senior populations, amongst others, but this is a part of her farewell, if you will, to her studio at the Dragon Kiln. So a certain kind of courage requires us as challenged by Angie, to measure a benchmark. It might not be the most intuitive grammar of getting us to rethink what measurement does. But often when we talk about what is effective and we're talking about impact, we are talking about measurement. So looking at this bench on which we're invited to sit, you may or may not decide to place yourself along this particular spectrum of failure, struggle, recovery, and success. Some might say somehow, always, anyhow. And to the right of the image, you would also see a vertical measurement, and that has to do with the ways in which we measure growth, especially of children, for those of us who have offspring, or those of us who remember being an offspring. As you grow up, you might be measured against some part of the door, of the wall. If we look closely, or if you visit Singapore, you'll find that what Angie does is flip the chart such that you start and you approach zero as you grow in height. The idea here is that we tend to think that as we grow older, accumulate in age, we accumulate experience, and therefore we are perhaps wiser, but at least just more experienced. That is not necessarily untrue, but as we heard from a comment in the audience from the earlier lecture, in fact, sometimes having a child's sense of curiosity, of wonder, is what will get us back to that moment of imagination, such that we cannot even be tempted to wallow in despair, because the point is to move forward. But if we are not to move forward or backwards, up or down, but think with and in and together, what might that picture look like? So in order to get us away from measurement, here's a little quote, and here's the touch of martial art, if you will. Bruce Lee, I hope you've enjoyed some movies by him. He also did some writing, apparently, and certainly a lot of the interviews. This came from an interview script coined Liberate Yourself. So anybody who's interested in Jeet Kune Do, so this is Cantonese, for a particular kind of martial art, which is about redirecting the flow of the energy and the force, not to counter it, but to redirect. So be water is also something that Bruce Lee has continued to repeat in the way that he has been teaching his way of being, if you will, martial or otherwise. The point here is that first, that whenever we learn anything, it's less about the name of the thing that is learnt, but when it is done, it is like the boat that helped you cross the water. You don't keep on carrying the boat. You've crossed to the other bank, you move. Yeah? So it's less about what you know and whether you could find accreditation, if you will. And I do appreciate that we are at a university. And therefore, all the more important to actually make that point. And the second part of this particular quote is perhaps more instructive, if you will. Bruce Lee reminds us that as we point our finger to indicate the moon, it is not so much that we look at the finger and keep on focusing on the fact that it is your finger or that the finger is pointing, but you're looking at what is being pointed to. So let's not miss the moon for the finger. So after warming up, let's huddle in. If we want to think about collective power, if we want to think about maybe the power of community arts and participatory arts, well, we have a project, PACESETTERS, or the individual art installations and the particular acts, theater, piece, performance that we would find enriching and also populous, if you will, at the Galway International Festival of the Arts. So we have a project, how can we build on loss or grief, or in the process of mourning, reconstruct, build, regenerate, and under one umbrella. So we start with the big tent, And now we're imagining an umbrella that might shield us, or at least help us weather the storm. I hope we have experienced this. A show of hands, please, those of us who have been at Funeral for Ashes. Wonderful, well done. I understand that it admits multiple visits, also because no visit will yield the same effect. And the ways in which we come to be immersed and come to be a part of the creative process is quite magical, if you will, even though there is no magic about it. In fact, hard science and facts. John and Connor are here. Thank you for being here and presenting this work. If we're enticed by the lights and the sounds, if we're looking at the patterns on the floor as with the walls in ways that make us think not just of trees and leaves and the elements that build perhaps a forest that we might be missing, but also think about temperature and the ways in which particular spectrum and spectra actually allow us to gain insight into how we are situated amongst others, then we might also take into account how the ways in which PACESETTERS as a project also enables research, and the ways in which a different kind of data, or a data that is differently rendered, actually makes an impact in the way that we become aware of what there is to know. Those of us who were here earlier at around 2:15 would have heard directly from Qadir and Osama. Thank you, our two interns who worked on this project in order to make that point about the importance of multiple ways of knowing. There are facts, there are data collected by our friends from Climate Action, and then actually the argument is built. So for every data point, for every statistic, it is so because we are telling a story. Evidence doesn't naturally come from data. It is through the putting together, the lacing together, the finding of patterns, and risking an argument that we start to have any spot to start thinking together. So thank you for that team. That allows us to actually render the point of climate action very clear. Research in itself is active too. Without research, there can be no advocacy, if you will. But once again, coming back to the title of the workshop, the affect is in the effect of the reception of the argument, and of course the attention that is necessary to draw us to the argument and engage with it in the first place. The affect comes from the undeniable giving over to an aesthetic experience that allows us to hear sounds that perhaps are too soft for the human ear, or of a different kind such that our observation and understanding becomes limited. The power of art is for these points to come together as one experience, that we are in a way swallowed whole into it. And for that moment, that brief moment, maybe 20 minutes, that we spend in an installation, we catch a glimpse into the possibilities of a world that would otherwise not stand and not remain if we were not to fight for it. Along with that, this is an installation, an architectural one that is also artistic. In Belgium some years ago, as part of the Europalia Indonesia, Iko Pravoto passed away in 2023. He is an Indonesian architect, artist, advocate for the environment. And here we have Balai Kambang that translates from Indonesian into floating pavilion. So these are bamboo structures that were built on the waters of Europe in order to render the point that habitats in Southeast Asia are being drowned, and there are all sorts of architectural means to ensure that livelihood and habitats can continue. But climate change is not nigh, it is happening. So how do these beautiful structures that spread across calm waters actually get us to understand that perhaps there is something that we need to do altogether? ECO's passing in 2023 coincided with the launch of the first MA Arts and Ecology program in Singapore and also in Southeast Asia, which I am honored to facilitate and guide through in my current role. So what transpired is that ECO's office, which is composed by his 3 sons, they decided to come to Singapore anyway and to finish that project. In honor of their father, they built a pavilion of bamboo. In objectives, the yellow chapel-like structure that you see on the top photo, that is one of our centers for photography in Singapore. And the pavilion itself is rebuilt and made into a community space. So the kind of art that is also architectural, that supports gathering, is a point that we're able to render clear through our first launch exhibition entitled Alternative Ecology, the Community. And that happened during Singapore Art Week in 2024. This is followed by a second launch exhibition in August 2024, so later that year, on redistributing the sensible. So insofar as we would like joy to guide us towards imagination, what is crucial is that we also widen our sensibilities, if you will. What art does is to reattune our sensitivity to those things that make us curious, make us wonder. And from then on, allows us to sense, sometimes in more intense ways, other times in multiple ways, such that we know what there is around us, or we become reacquainted with those emotions, aesthetic elements that allow us to imagine differently. So here we have various elements of a more conventional exhibition. We had an artist who is also somebody who is a researcher at NASA. So that is Rochelle Gribble in the bottom right corner. And then above her is a data visualization of the stock market. It's not a competition, but the artist, who is otherwise also an ophthalmologist, is looking at US data and China data and rendering that into real estate bubbles, as you will, if you will. So that is accompanied by 2 artists who are also musicians, and there is a sound performance to activate that particular opening. So if we look more carefully into the micro and into the macro of the cosmos, we find that, in fact, when it comes to arts and ecology in terms of climate action, there is too much to do and also too little to do. So where does that leave us? The umbrella. When young people come together at age 15 to 17 and realize that it is important to practice being together, not in school, not sitting in rows, not in front of the blackboard listening to a talking head in the front of the classroom, but to learn together and learn to fight together. This is an image from the Central Business District equivalent of Hong Kong back in 2013 when the umbrella movement took place. In the same way that the WTO, World Trade Organization Ministerial in Seattle in 1999 happened, because of the sheer number of people quietly going about their business in public, cars were blocked, bankers were not able to get to work in easy ways. There are government offices that have to shut down because of fear of riot, although what we see here is quite a peaceful scene. So how does coming under one metaphorical umbrella allow us to actually find another mode to learn together and to learn to live together. I'm not suggesting that protest is the only way. Once again, activism and effect, art and affect. But perhaps there is a communal practice that can be honed, a social practice that allows us to be reacclimatized, resensitized to what it means to have very little to lose. There was a comment about capitalism being the root of all our issues, climate or otherwise, in the discussion that followed the lecture at 1 p.m. And there doesn't seem to be much more to say after that. Or so was the atmosphere in the room. But what if we're not thinking about consumption or means or modes of production? It's not that they don't exist, but if we suspend those for a while and think about why existence matters, what makes recycling meaningful, then perhaps we are more likely to be motivated to recycle, rather than perhaps to listen to rules or to wait for incentives to do what is generally and commonly or universally known as correct. How can we decide for ourselves what we need to do at every moment because we are moved to do it? How do we make the revolution irresistible? So as we cool with after warming up and huddling in. This is not a panel about climate. One person does not a panel make. So if you want to make it a panel, the stairs are here. These are 3 lines or actually 3 phrases taken from the title of a poem by a climate activist who was at a COP. So there was also a comment about how COPs are ineffective. They might be ineffective for its purported purpose, but it's effective in other ways in giving voice to those who care, in the same way that the question and answer period in the past, for the past lecture allowed for that too. So the title of the poem is exactly this. On another panel about climate, they ask me to sell the future, and all I've got is a love poem. It's a panel about climate, so a particular kind of setting. You might imagine a stage like this, maybe with more chairs. I'm being asked to talk about the future, maybe at this panel, but no, I am being asked to sell the future, a particular kind of future, with a vision already. If we only think about vision, even in the metaphorical sense, perhaps we are not feeling it right now. And if we're not feeling it right now, maybe it doesn't make sense to think about the future. Once again, the affect of motivation that requires presence. And all I've got is a love poem. Love, big thing. Poem, maybe a smaller thing. But in combination, maybe something powerful. We had lots of theories. Just now, I have lots of theories as a philosopher, much less proof. But we've already considered that perhaps proof is as good as fiction. And when a novel is good, you learn more than a textbook or a documentary, maybe. So this is a quote from a rare essay by Louise Glück, the Nobel laureate for 2020 in literature. She has since passed, and this is a quote in an essay called Disruption, Hesitation, Silence. Louise Glück is a poet, but she also writes about poetry. So here's a bit of literary analysis, if you will, in a volume that is coined Proofs and Theories. I'm actually going to read all of this with you. It seems to me that what is wanted in art is to harness the power of the unfinished. All earthly experience is partial, not simply because it is subjective, but because that which we do not know of the universe, of mortality, is so much more vast than that which we do know. What is unfinished or has been destroyed participates in these mysteries. The problem is to make a whole that does not forfeit that power. How do we leave gaps, allow for disruption, permit hesitation, and appreciate silence, such that the work and the power of art can become complete without filling it in ourselves? Maybe something like this. An installation by Indonesian artist Edita Atmaja at the most recent art jog, which is the art festival, Visual Arts Festival in Jakarta, Indonesia. It opened in June, so just last month. What Edita is doing is to look at pioneering species. We tend to think of invasive species or native species, but pioneering species has one particular characteristic. So think about mosses, for instance, and where moss grows. You find a nook, you find a cranny, and it still has life. In environments, abandoned apartments, construction sites, we find pioneering species living. So how do we, perhaps, as a strategy for climate action, actually take up some of these characteristics? The artist's point is, we already are. Whenever we need to move continents, cross seas, and consider migration, when we think about the ways in which we're carried by containers and carried by each other through disaster, catastrophes, as well as moments of joy and rites of passage, there is something of the pioneering spirit there. It is not only there to devastate or to gain imperial or colonial power, not necessarily. So if we look at a different species altogether, what can we learn? And how do we make that point more effectively and immersively if we are to be able to present it in a way that, as you can see in this image, comes across as something like a lab, maybe something that would come out of a science fiction novel, maybe a bit speculative. It certainly drew the attention of the little boy in the photograph. So, what are the aesthetic qualities that allow us to reimagine our environment in order to render a point? We needn't use art or instrumentalize it to create a vision for the sake of science communication. Art and science is not so separate in the way that it speculates, that it tells stories, that it allows us to be triggered into action. So if art in itself is the argument and presents it, perhaps the affect and the effect can be linked. And a bit more from the poem that made, the title of which made for this final section. Aisha Siddiqa is an American Pakistani activist, also a poet, as you can see, founded Polluters Out in 2020 and also Fossil Fuel University. In the context of US America, but I think the following is large and around the world. So this is a poem that she presented when she was asked to speak on another panel about the climate, and was asked to sell the future. These are some lines, but let me share a little bit more. The poem starts, "What if the future is soft and revolution is so kind that there is no end to us in sight? Whole cities breathe and bad luck is bested by a promise to the leaves. To withstand your own end is difficult. The future frolics about, promise to no one as is her right. Rage against injustice makes the voice grow harsher still. If the future leaves without us, the silence that will follow will be an unspeakable nothing. What if we convince her to stay? How rare and beautiful it is that we exist. What if we stun existence one more time? The earth remembers everything. Our bodies are the color of the earth, and we are nobodies. Been born so many apocalypses. What's one more? Love is still the only revenge. It grows each time the earth is set on fire. But for what it's worth, I'd do this again. Gamble on humanity 100 times over, commit to life unto life as the trees fall and take us with them. I'd follow love into extinction. And we come to a bit of design in order to complement art, because in the same way that art and science are not so separate, neither is art and design. This is a canopy, a sunshade net that is designed by Allzone, a collective of designers from Bangkok, specifically for the occasion of the Sharjah Architectural Triennial. This was back in 2023, and the title, if you will, of this purposive structure above the canopy of geometric shapes is Set the Controls to the Heart of the Sun. There was somebody who used to work in the UN who spoke quite eloquently towards the end of the last lecture. She spoke to how the heart, the hands, and the mind need to join forces in order for us to be moved to action, and also shared some initiatives that she made since retirement. Here we have what is an old site of a primary school in Sharjah, changed into or giving over to art and design. And from there on, we see the geometric shapes allowing for wind and ventilation when there is unrelenting heat during the day in the middle of the desert. And then in the evening, when the earth cools and the atmosphere becomes cool, sometimes too chilly, the sunshade net opens up to allow for ventilation from the ground up. So top down and ground up. These are the motions and also the directions of what it means, perhaps, to be propositional, not just with each other as human beings, but for human beings to also gain that relationship and understanding with the more than human. And then, of course, all the elements and the particles that independent of our existence. As we move towards extinction, but in the comfort and the embrace of love, actually allow us to let hope stay a while longer, such that a future or the contemplation of a future makes sense. Thank you so much. If anybody has any comments or feedback, I'd love to hear. I think there is a mic that is floating around. Thank you very much. Any thoughts are welcome.
Thank you so much. I just think there's a lot to contemplate. Sorry. Yeah, I don't particularly have a question, but just thank you. I think there's a lot to consider in what you've shared with us, and it's very thought-provoking. So thank you.
Thank you. I think, if anything, I feel that if a philosopher is a lover of wisdom, then I think it's about approximating it, kind of getting back to that zero, if you will. And I think that in itself kind of inspires just a lot of ways of putting different data points together, if you will. Perhaps not prioritizing logic or even being convinced of patterns, but to take that risk. That makes thinking fun. And that kind of addiction is welcomed anytime in my world. So thank you. Yes, please.
One thing that I found interesting, actually, is the umbrella thing that you showed.
Yes.
I don't think only youth people wants that or needs
all being together, away from all this fast rhythm and fast life. Everyone wants to get to work, wants to go back home. It's a routine. It's very mental consuming, I would say, and exhausting. So I would say if this initiative would be something on a bigger aspect in each country, in each city, in a local community, here in Galway, let's say, if we just created such space in the streets of Galway and just sat and shared ideas and just live the moment of silence or even talking about things we love, things that interest us, it would be a great thing, especially when you mentioned that it also shut down a lot of governmental institutions, which is actually a change in the climate. So we are doing actions by just being together and gathering. So we are doing a change. So that would be great if it's implemented on a bigger aspect.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the movement in Hong Kong was inspired and preceded by the Arab Spring, right? So all of the concerns there, even though they're motivated differently, so there are different institutional factors that motivated movements from around the world. But insofar as the silence of empty shoes in Tahrir Square, right? That in itself being a protest, even though there is no body there standing or chanting. And when people are standing, they are silent. So there are performance artists. So I'm thinking of James Lee Byer, who coined that the most perfect performance is standing still, or standing still is a perfect performance. It actually takes a lot of energy to stay still, to keep calm, to in fact cool with. So a part of this particular project in Sharjah is also to reacclimatize the ways in which citizens of deserts actually cognize temperature, internal and exterior, internal to oneself, internal to a built environment, and external to oneself, i.e. with other bodies that are of different temperatures or outdoors. So I think the thermal also takes into account, there was a lot of facts around global warming, and that was actually the term being used at the lecture just now. So alongside climate change, and we know the cooling effects around the world as well, along with the warming up. So how do we cool with? But also not lose sight of the warming up together. And I think all around different campuses in different parts of the world also went through a lot of these movements and moments of sitting together quietly in order to share presence, if you will, and what could be learned from that. And we don't even have to think about how meditative that is or that we need to do some collective breathing exercise. I think to know that it matters that we are present already shifts our attention away from the kind of productivity and the ways in which we prize performance in different institutions and also socially.
Yeah, and just to continue on your ideas, like the idea of silence to me would be motivating. As a person, maybe my personality would be intrigued by this idea to go to such gatherings, and I think a lot would agree with me, because if you just told me come to this protest or this movement, I might be not so interested in joining and being an activist in such a thing or such a cause, even if I feel sorry or empathy towards the cause, but I would not love to be seen in a way that, oh, I'm just activism. I don't know what's the word, if it's a verb. But being present and just feel surrounded by people who care about this would actually make such a difference. And yeah, maybe it could be started in schools or universities. I'm just thinking. Thank you so much anyway.
Yes, of course.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for that. That was so interesting. I could listen to you speak all day, I think. Just when you were mentioning there about motivating and what motivates people, I just wanted to share the the other day I was listening to the radio and I heard of a community somewhere in Ireland, and they are collaboratively recycling the bottles, the plastic bottles and tins, and you get money back. And as a community then they're using that money to buy kits, I think it was like football kits or something for the kids. And it just got me thinking that there needs to be more of that sort of like an emphasis more on community rather than the self, because obviously each person can just recycle their own bottles and claim their own money and do as they please with that. But I think that just was so inspiring to hear of a little community, and that they're instilling that sort of teachings into the kids as well, that teamwork, and I think in the arts as well, that's so important. And I think that connection and kind of maybe moving away from the self and just kind of thinking more how you can yourself maybe give back to your community to foster that sort of connection, I think is really important. Yeah, I just wanted to share that. I just thought it was inspiring, and yeah.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. There are also collectivist ways of thinking, maybe. So it's not so much that we need to forget ourselves or become selfless, which is another, possibly psychologically, a self-serving way to be. So when we give, are we expecting reciprocity, for instance? Or what are we accruing? Are we accruing credit for us? So in some Indigenous cultures that I've had the chance to visit and learn from in Canada, the more indebted you are to your community, the richer you are, if that makes sense. Because gifts are freely given and nothing is asked back. Or this kind of gift giving is not transactional. And in that context, it's still from Canada, although from a different community, this time from Montreal. Those of us who are familiar with the Sense Lab at Concordia University, which has more recently in the past 10 years recoined themselves the 3E Lab, the 3 Ecologies Lab, has started to change its practices from reading groups and research papers and grants and research projects to immersive experiential projects that allowed for groups of PhDs, postdocs, and full professors to every summer move north to Quebec, to a rural community, to, with the permission of the Indigenous peoples there, tap for maple syrup. They built their own pots from scratch and learned how to stoke the fire in ways such that the syrup would be of the particular consistency, bottle it, and it's all special one-off single batches of things that could sell. The money goes back to allowing the Indigenous populations to buy back parts of the forest from the government. So I think there are these slow, but conscientious and very intentional movements around the world. We could argue as to whether that is artful at all or whether it's effective in the long run. But I think as a project in itself, the affect is clear. I think there is something a little bit less immediate than the football kit, but I think insofar as giving back to generations backwards and therefore forwards, right? These are contrary motions that in fact just form one ecosystem of intention, if you will. But thank you. There.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks so much. I guess it's a beautiful perspective to look at these things from a very poetic point of view, to open this ambiguity and imagination in these ways, all the possibilities that sometimes the empiric science don't allow to be. I would like to come back to this point of the redistribution of the sensible. And it means how we redistribute what we can sense, what we can perceive, and the ways it is perceived as well. Not only what is this, but how it emerges and how it affects our societies. Drawing from personal experience in collectivism, anarchism, self-organization in Barcelona, when these acts of redistribution happen, such, for example, to give visibility to minorities or all type of, well, you can imagine the long list that keeps invisible to the eyes of the state and institutions, etc. One of the big walls normally we find and has to be trespassed is policies.
Yep.
Is how from redistributing from the bottom, there is a point, it has been proven through history, that is from this very bottom activism, policies change. But this is a constant negotiation. Or even if we think as big festivals like this and so many others, there is always this negotiation between what is visible and what is not, what we have to talk about, how it has to be. And then we have the numbers and the profits and the benefits, that everything gets very complicated. So what would be your, how can I say, your point of view through these negotiations that are happening all the time, and if there is any way to accelerate these negotiations or to open these spaces for changing these policies from the bottom up.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's exactly those policies, those, if we understand policies as creative constraints, this is hypothetical, and I am not underestimating the frustration that comes with decision-making processes that are not inclusive. So also giving a proper responsibility, which is a responsiveness to our colleagues, sometimes even friends in government, and not necessarily seeing bureaucracy as something that is a necessary evil, but in its original intention is to depersonalize processes as such that nepotism, for instance, and abuse of power wouldn't take place as frequently. Policies now operate in various ways for various people. So if it is a case that there is a policy that perhaps opposes a barrier or a funding instrument that it doesn't allow for wider eligibility. And here I completely agree with my friends. I hope you would admit me as a friend from Climate Action, that what is good to the environment or good for the environment is also a good business proposition. That culture and commerce are not separate, have never been separate, whether it's patronage or sponsorship or philanthropy or, in fact, the state distribution of funds. And that complex nexus of how we come to afford to be creative as makers. Those of us who are willing to work with and find the gaps, like the pioneering species, would possibly find some joy in that particular investigation or that particular challenge. I don't mean to make light of difficulties, but I think insofar as we saw in the last talk at 1 p.m. that in fact it is very clear what the issues and the problems are. And there is a very little sense or even motivation perhaps to think about action or collective action. Of course, complaining is also action in the same way that there are uses for rage and anger, as we know from bell hooks. So, with all of that, how do we generate energy for change? I think we all have ways to cope. I hope cognitive dissonance becomes less and less prominent in the future. And And if we could imagine the possibility of a future that allows for that complexity of differences and even frustrations to continue to foment, right? So think about fermentation. For those of us who enjoy wine, might especially appreciate this, or kombucha. However you flow, it's a balance of these things. If an ecosystem is not to be dictated and handed over for everybody to benefit, just using the exact word that was used in the last lecture, but to think of how we can share in the gifting, then we might come to a position of joyful militancy, that we still fight, and we fight hard, and we have our goals and our aims. We do have our personal messages that sometimes comes across absolutely conscientious, to which nobody could object, and we might present it that way. But if it is a balanced equilibrium, then perhaps everybody would get to express some of this at some point. In that case, I think silence plays a role in that at any point for anybody to be heard, the rest of us need to listen and be quiet for that moment. But it's not a silence of inaction, it's an active listening. In fact, a hungry sort of listening, because we want that sensible to be redistributed through our attention to those sounds and sights and feelings and the ways in which we become sensitive to a different kind of distance or intimacy. So proprioception, when you kind of know that something is around, right? And bringing it right back to sabotage. What we see and what we saw on stage yesterday are actually refractions of ourselves, our internal struggles, the ways in which we are socially constrained and confined in different ways, that we find ways to express ourselves and live nonetheless. It is more than survival. It is a thriving that we gift ourselves by finding the space to be, even if only for those 5 minutes of a balancing act. It is just incredibly instructive to me that sabotage opened the festival here. It is a strong statement of how being political is about being together, to be in the round, not looking away, and concentrating on holding up that space for expression to take place. It is so important, and we don't see this in a lot of festivals, even the very, very lauded ones around the world. Similar acts might travel to different places in the world, but there was something that was very potent yesterday. And I think if we put politics in the center, not because we come from particular parties and we vote this way or that, even if we don't get to vote. If we're willing to be political with each other, it is a commitment to not look away from conflict, to see each other as differences that could generate a future. If the future is already carved out, perhaps we might lose interest. So what is it to live with and beside each other, and also the rest of the world that otherwise expresses itself in the parliament of things that it doesn't speak, perhaps, in natural languages? How do we become familiar and make new the ways in which we come to be in and with our environment? Perhaps that is the crux of arts and ecology. That is a crux of any meaningful and rewarding climate action. Whether we reach net zero in 2030, we can perhaps also maybe just leave that to the policymakers who are doing important things too, and maybe to institutions like the UN. If the world were ever to be universalizable, if the world is to be a happy family because we all subscribe to the same rules and regulations, as maybe in contradistinction to being able to imagine together and differently. I think that is the proposition here, that climate action is creative, fundamentally. That action itself also requires us to commit to a kind of imagining of something other than the status quo. I've kept you till 10 past, so I think if we'd like to continue discussions, please, we can perhaps take it outside so that the venue itself could also start to rest a little bit. Thank you so much for being here, and enjoy the rest of the festival.